Welcome back to Light of the Word, the podcast where we take a thoughtful look at faith, history, and truth. I'm so glad you're here today. We're going to dive into one of the most common and sometimes most challenging questions about Christianity. Is there any evidence for Jesus outside the Bible? It's a question that comes up in conversations with skeptics, friends who are curious, and sometimes even among believers themselves. After all, if Jesus truly lived, if he truly walked this earth, shouldn't there be more than just the Bible that talks about him? So today we're going to explore that together. And I think you'll be surprised at just how much history tells us, even from people who didn't believe in him at all. Now, let's be honest for a moment. When someone asks, is there any evidence for Jesus outside the Bible? What they often really mean is this: I don't trust the Bible. That's the heart of the issue. People may read the Gospels and say, sure, I see what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote, but they were followers of Jesus. Isn't that biased? It's an interesting objection, but think about it. Who else would you expect to write about Jesus in such detail, if not the people who actually knew him best? The disciples weren't just casual observers. They spent years walking with him, listening to his teaching, watching his miracles, and even seeing his death and resurrection. Of course, their lives were changed. Of course, they believed. But here's the catch. Many people want outside voices. They want to hear from people who weren't believers. They want to see what historians, skeptics, or even enemies of Christianity had to say. And you know what? That's a fair request. If Jesus truly lived, left an impact, and had followers who turned the world upside down, then surely traces of his life would appear in history beyond the Bible. So let's set aside scripture for a few minutes and walk through those outside voices together. Alright, let's start by looking at what I like to call the unfriendly witnesses. These are not Christians, not followers of Jesus, not people who had any reason to promote the Christian faith. In fact, some of them were skeptical, some were critical, and some even hostile. And yet, they still wrote about him. 1. Thallus, 1st century. The first is a historian named Thallus, writing around the middle of the 1st century, not long after Jesus' death. His original works are lost, but fragments survive through later writers. What's interesting is that he mentions the darkness and the earthquake at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. Now, Thallus tried to explain it away as a solar eclipse. But think about what that means. In order to give his explanation, he had to admit that the crucifixion happened, that there was darkness, and that people remembered it. Even skeptics were talking about it. 2. Tacitus, early 2nd century. Next, we have one of Rome's greatest historians, Tacitus. In his Annals, written around AD 115, he describes how Emperor Nero blamed Christians for the fire in Rome. Tacitus explains that Christus, from whom Christians take their name, suffered the extreme penalty under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Tacitus doesn't like Christians. He calls their faith a mischievous superstition. But while insulting them, he confirms several details. Jesus lived, he was executed under Pilate during Tiberius' reign, and his movement spread all the way to Rome. 3. Mara bar Serapion, 1st, 2nd century. Then there's Mara bar Serapion, a Syrian philosopher writing a letter to his son. He compares the deaths of famous thinkers like Socrates and Pythagoras, and then he mentions the Jews who executed their wise king. He notes that after killing their wise king, their kingdom was taken from them, but that his teachings lived on through his followers. He doesn't use the name Jesus, but the description matches him perfectly. The King of the Jews, crucified, yet whose teaching endured. 4. Phlegon, 1st, 2nd century. Another historian, Phlegon, also mentions Jesus. We only know his words through later authors, but they report that he spoke of Jesus predicting future events and, astonishingly, rising from the dead, showing the marks of crucifixion in his hands. Again, this is not a Christian testimony, but it shows that stories about Jesus' resurrection were already circulating widely. 5. Pliny the Younger, early 2nd century. Finally, we come to Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor who wrote to Emperor Trajan around AD 112. He wasn't writing theology, he was asking how to deal with Christians in his province. He describes how they would gather early in the morning, sing hymns to Christ as to a god, and bind themselves by oath to live morally, avoiding fraud, theft, and adultery. Pliny isn't endorsing their faith, but he confirms this. From the very beginning, Christians worshiped Jesus as God himself. So from just these non-Christian, even hostile sources, what do we learn? Jesus lived in history, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, caused a darkness and earthquake at his death, was called the Wise King, was believed to have risen from the dead, and was worshipped as God by his followers. That's a remarkable amount of information without ever opening a Bible. So far, we've looked at pagan and Roman historians. But what about Jewish sources? Interestingly, there is one Jewish historian who gives us important testimony about Jesus, Flavius Josephus. Josephus was born just a few years after the crucifixion of Jesus. He was a Jewish priest, soldier, and historian, commissioned by the Romans to write a history of the Jewish people. His writings are massive, covering centuries of Jewish history. And in the middle of all that, he makes reference to Jesus. Now, some versions of his text were later tampered with by Christian scribes who tried to make the passage sound more Christian. But when scholars strip away those later additions, what remains is still powerful. Here's the reliable core of what Josephus wrote. Around this time lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was a worker of amazing deeds and was a teacher of people who gladly accept the truth. He won over both many Jews and many Greeks. Pilate, when he heard him accused by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross. But those who had loved him from the first did not cease to do so. To this day, the tribe of Christians, named after him, has not disappeared. Do you hear what Josephus is saying? He confirms that Jesus was a real historical figure, known for his wisdom and miraculous deeds. He confirms that Pilate condemned him to the cross. And he tells us that, even after his death, his followers remained devoted, and that movement had not disappeared even decades later. This is remarkable because Josephus was not a Christian. He was a Jew writing history for the Romans. He had no reason to invent these details. Yet he affirms the very same facts that the Gospels proclaim. Jesus lived, he taught, he performed works that astonished people, he was crucified under Pilate, and his followers remained faithful. So let's stop for a moment and gather everything we have heard so far. Imagine for a second that you had never opened a Bible in your life. You never read the Gospels, you never studied the letters of Paul, you never picked up any Christian writing at all. The only information available to you came from outsiders, from Roman historians, from pagan philosophers, from Jewish writers who had no interest in promoting Christianity. What picture of Jesus would you see then? Surprisingly, the portrait that emerges is not empty, it is not vague, and it is not insignificant. From these unfriendly and sometimes hostile voices, we learn that Jesus was a real man who lived in Judea in the first century. He was remembered as a wise teacher, a man of virtue, a worker of unusual and even miraculous deeds. He drew both Jewish and Gentile followers, men and women who were so deeply moved by his words and actions that they devoted themselves fully to him. We also learn that he did not speak like an ordinary rabbi. He claimed things about himself that were bold and even divine. And what is more, his followers actually worshipped him as God. The Jewish leaders were offended by him, and they accused him of crimes worthy of death. The Roman governor Pontius Pilate, under the reign of Emperor Tiberius, condemned him to the cross. At his crucifixion, strange events were remembered, a darkness over the land, even an earthquake that shook the ground. And yet, after his death, his disciples did not scatter forever. They began to proclaim something extraordinary. They said that 3 days later Jesus rose from the dead. They said they saw him, they touched him, they saw the wounds in his hands. And in the face of persecution, in the face of torture and even execution, they refused to deny what they had seen. They continued to worship him, to sing to him, to teach in his name, and to die for him. When you put all of this together, you end up with a powerful confirmation. Even without the Bible, even without the testimony of believers, the outsiders tell us that Jesus lived, that he died under Pilate, and that his followers proclaimed him risen and worshipped him as God. That is not a small amount of evidence. That is a stunning and remarkable historical footprint left by the most important figure in human history. As we bring this journey to a close, I want you to reflect on what we have discovered together. We asked a simple but profound question. Is there any evidence for Jesus outside the Bible? And we found that the answer is yes. Pagan historians, Roman officials, Jewish writers, none of them had a reason to defend Christianity, and yet they spoke of Jesus. They confirmed that he lived, that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, that his followers proclaimed he rose from the dead, and that they worshipped him as God. These voices do not tell the full story of the gospel, but they do give us a powerful confirmation that the story of Jesus is not a myth, not a legend invented centuries later, but history rooted in time and space. Now here is where the question turns back to us. If Jesus truly lived, if he truly died, and if his earliest followers were willing to suffer and die proclaiming that he rose again, then the story of Jesus demands our attention. It is not just ancient history to be studied from a distance. It is a living reality that still speaks today. The same Jesus who walked the streets of Galilee, who healed the sick, who taught with authority, who was nailed to a cross, and who, his disciples said, walked out of the tomb alive, that Jesus still calls people to follow him. So the invitation is simple but life-changing. Don't dismiss him as a myth. Don't ignore him as just another teacher. Take seriously the evidence of history and the testimony of those who knew him best. And then, take the next step. Consider who Jesus is for you. Because if he is who he claimed to be, the way, the truth, and the life, then your response to him is the most important decision you will ever make. Thank you for joining me in this exploration. I hope this has given you something solid to think about, something meaningful to share, and perhaps even the beginning of a journey that could change your life forever.